education, please be sure to scan your badge at the scanner located in the back of the seating area at the conclusion of this session. Scanners shut off 15 minutes post-session, so please get your badge scanned before networking with the speakers. Also note that to qualify for CEUs and CPEs, the session must run a full 60 minutes. That 60 minutes can include Q&A, so please have questions ready for the speakers to fill the time requirement. Full details on continuing education program are available in the TechNet Cyber app and the conference website. Thank you, and now over to our speakers.
Hey, thank you very much. Welcome to this session. We're going to talk about the state of DevSecOps across the Department of Defense. My name is George Lamb. I'm the Director of Cloud and Software Modernization for the DoD CIO. And we've got some distinguished speakers from Carnegie Mellon, the Software Engineering Institute, with us today. We started this sort of concept of doing a state of DevSecOps based on the, if you follow Google, what they do with the state of DevSecOps, the DORA metrics kind of falling into the state of DevOps in the commercial space. We thought that was an appropriate thing to do in the department. We've been on this journey for about 5 years, so people that are tracking software development in the Department of Defense, we have this legacy of legacy software, something called the waterfall process. We've been trying to change that for about 25 years. So 5 years ago, we made a concerted effort to really go after it, looking at sort of the history, looking at the mistakes, and then seeing where industry is with DevOps and Agile programming. So that was kind of the genesis. As we went through this, we're at the 5-year part of that transformation. We've got some amazing success stories. At the CIO office, we wanted to get third-party verification of what we're doing. So we reached out to Carnegie Mellon at the Software Engineering Institute, and we said, you guys are in the field, you know what's happening, we think we know what's happening, but we want to do a true quantitative assessment of where the department is. So with that, I want to introduce my two co-speakers, Bridget and Nanette from SEI, and then we'll start talking about the history.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I know 8:15 is tough, especially in the DC area. So for those of you that drove in this morning, thank you for making it to this session. So I'm Bridget O'Hearn from Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. I've actually worked for or around the DoD my entire 30-year career. I was a DoD civilian for 20 years. And my last job was Chief Software Officer of the F-35. Actually worked with Sadat. Where did you go? He was here. There he is. We actually worked in F-35 together. And actually helped stand up the DevSecOps environment for the F-35. So kind of went from that, we're going to talk about the SWAP study here in a minute, from the SWAP study to where we are today. Have been along with the ride for quite some time. Really excited to share the report with you today. Nanette?
Okay, yeah, I'm Nanette Brown, also with Carnegie Mellon SEI, and I've been with the SEI part-time from 2009 to 2014, and then full-time. Before that, actually, my career was not involved in the DoD. It was I was totally in industry, in corporate, non-DoD related. And since I've come to the SEI, I've been doing a lot of work on Agile, Lean, DevSecOps, operational test processes, and I was delighted to get the opportunity to work on this because it sort of pulls together a lot of the skill sets of the SEI.
So this is going to be more of an informal kind of study. We're going to chat, walk through some things. The slides are there. Has anybody read the study Software is Never Done, the DibSwap report? We say that a lot. We kind of think it's like the history. Familiar with it? Yeah,
we got one.
People.
All right.
So
if you haven't, it's still out there.
It's still
you can go read it.
And it's still very relevant. That's kind of the cool thing about it. We move slow in the DoD. I've only been here 4 years, and it's been kind of a slog. We're making progress slowly, sometimes in fits, but when you look back 5 years from where we were to where we are now, it's been pretty momentous. DibSwap report came out with the realization that most of our programs were in trouble. There was a lot of failing programs. We were using the legacy waterfall approaches that it took about 2 to 5 years before you saw any results. The transformation in the commercial space happened around 2000. So we did the DibSwap report in 2019, so that was 20 years after our first transformation to Agile. So it took us a long time to realize that Agile is the way to go. There's lots of metrics, there's lots of technology in place supporting Agile, and we weren't embracing that. So the DibSwap report said, software really is never done. The way that we acquire software, the way we develop software, the way that we integrate the end users into the software process, they're all kind of broken. The speed with which we develop software actually put us at risk. We weren't able to ingest changes, ingest security patches. The whole model was fundamentally broken. So that's when we started doing this transformation towards software factories, DevOps. In the commercial space, it's called DevOps. In the Department of Defense, the sort of the focus on the security that we have, the problems that we have if we get hacked. So we inject security into the middle. So in the Defense Department, it's DevSecOps. In the commercial space, it's DevOps. The fundamental tooling is the same. The concept of pipelines, the concept of breaking down silos, the concept of rapidly spinning through it. People sometimes don't think that when you inject security into the middle, you can spin fast, but we've got success stories to say that that's actually not true and we can do it. Around 2000, or 2020, 2021, 22, in response to the DibSwap report, some of the really visionary people in the department, they just started charging ahead. So you see the emergence of things like software factories, Platform One, Cloud One was kind of coming later. We had a lot of presidential innovation fellows. They made their way into the department. They were bringing the technology in. So Cloud One evolved as the first software factory, or Platform One evolved as the first software factory. We use the term software factory, and it set the framework for about 50 to 75 software factories in place right now. The other important thing that we did was we started to recognize the necessity for platform engineering and consistent platforms. So there's a lot of infrastructure at code that was developed in that time frame to rapidly stand up the capability to build software. DISA put an environment in place where you could push a button and you could go from a cloud contract to a functioning, secure cloud environment. People don't realize that when you go to the cloud, it doesn't really give you anything. You still need to define your environments, define your processes, define your security. You have to figure out how to get into the cloud. You have to figure out how to get between your dev test environments. There's no magic there. So standing up the ability to push a button and get that structure all stood up with an approved authority to operate was a pretty big deal. And that's been in place for about 2 or 3 years. In 2022, we approved the Software Modernization Implementation Plan. That was the first thing that codified this approach, looking at the goals that we wanted and how we actually do it across the department. We stood up the Senior Steering Group for Software Modernization. I don't know if anyone was here yesterday, but Rob Vietmeyer, Sean Brady, Alan Dianic, they were talking about that. That's the higher level construct that takes the CIO, the research branch of the department, the acquisition areas, so A&S, R&E, CIO working together, looking at how we bring the research, how we bring the acquisition framework, and how we sort of set the standard for developing software together. That's been operating for 2 years on an implementation plan. We just completed the 23-24 plan. The 25-26 plan has just been announced. It is on the public website. So if anybody wants to see what we're doing in DevSecOps for the next 2 years, go to the CIO library, look for the Software Modernization Implementation Plan for 25-26. It went live on Monday, so it's really new. It was supposed to accompany this report that we're talking about, the State of DevSecOps. This is going to go live. Every time I give a date, I get in trouble. I'm trying to get it to go live this week. It may or may not. It's an amazing report. So I hate to say it, but I hope it's almost as significant as the DibSwap report. Looking at where we've come, the DibSwap report was momentous. People are still quoting it. I'm hoping the State of DevSecOps gets that same recognition that we have a baseline of where we've come after 5 years. Incredibly important information from an evolutionary perspective and a really important guide for where we're going next. So if you kind of really want to understand where we are, this is a great capture of it. And with that, I'm going to let Bridget talk about some of the success stories that we've had over this 5-year journey.
Yeah, and I'll point out, we've got a little brochure on the seat, so you can kind of see it. Actually, we're going to kind of go to the inside. You can see some of the success stories that we have. This is meant to be a teaser because the report's not out yet. Like George said, it'll probably be out later this week. But we actually talked to about 50 software factories and collected a lot of lessons learned and success stories. And so some of the things that we talked to, of course, we talked to all the services and got some feedback from them on some of the things that they've done really well and, of course, what their challenges are. And so the report has all of those things. It's not all good news. There are things that we point out as challenges in there. But the success stories are things that I'm really excited about because, again, having worked in and around the DoD for 30 years, having first programmed on a digital equipment corporation, VAX. Many of you probably have no idea what that is. All right, we got a fist pump up there, right? Having developed code on a mainframe that, by the way, when our team hit compile, we would go play basketball for the next 3 or 4 hours because that's how long it took to find out if we had errors in the code. And then if we had to go fix them and start over, right, it was at least another 3, maybe another day before we could compile that code. The department has come really far in the 30 years, I feel like. I mean, for me, I feel like we are in an exciting place in the department. So we actually talked to the services, got their best practices. Those success stories really lay out a lot of really good things like, I don't know if you're familiar with the SWEGs, the software engineering groups within the Air Force. I actually worked with them. That was where I cut my teeth as an Air Force civilian. They were 3 organizations that operated as 3 separate organizations, but they had the same mission. Their mission was to organically sustain software for the Air Force, whether it was a business system, an EW system, an aircraft system, right? They sustained that software that was developed by primes and vendors. That was their mission. Some of them had been around when I was there already for 30 years doing this. And those 3 organizations, one at Robbins, one in Oklahoma, Robbins in Georgia, one in Oklahoma City, and one near Salt Lake City, Utah, those 3 organizations acted as competitors, right? Instead of acting as a collaborative entity that could actually leverage each other's best practices. Well, now today, actually a couple of years ago, they stood up a software directorate that combines all of the resources of those 3 organizations. It eliminates a lot of inefficiencies, but creates a lot of expertise. Somewhere around 3,000 software engineers strong within the Air Force now have the ability to influence software. That's a big deal for the Air Force and for the department. So that's one of the success stories that you'll read about in the report. Another one is from the Army. So the Army, they were one of the early ones to stand up their software factories. They've been really great about being very forward-leaning on their policies. They've put out policies saying there's no such thing as sustainment anymore. Guess what? That DIB swap study that George talked about said that software's never done, right? When you open the code to either fix a bug or develop a new line of code, it's development. There's no such thing really as maintenance or sustainment, right? But in the DoD, we separate those things. You have to have a different color of money to do development versus sustainment versus production. It's difficult. It's inefficient. It's complicated. But the Army has been really forward-leaning in putting out policies saying, we're not going to transition things to sustainment anymore. It's always going to be in development. We're going to use one color of money. We're going to make things a lot more efficient. So the Army, we've got a great success story about how the Army has put out those kinds of policies. They've stood up something called the SMART team, which is a software team that actually helps other software programs, whether they're in trouble or just to take and leverage their best practices. So we've got some great information. Actually, Lauren Pavlik is going to be here later today, I think with the software iPlan team to talk. And so she's the one who actually runs the SMART team. And so she'll be here, and if you're interested, you can ask her some questions about what the Army has done with this SMART team. If you heard Sean Brady yesterday talk about the software cadre, the software cadre is at the DoD level. The Army has their own team. The Navy has stood up a team. And then the Air Force has the software directorate. So now we're beginning across the services in DoD to have teams and organizations that are very focused on software. Versus, again, when I worked in the F-35, I was the chief software officer, and I didn't have other people I could reach out to in other places to talk to them necessarily about their challenges or to understand what resources they had. Now we're beginning to pool those resources and expertise across the department, which again is a phenomenal success story. And then the Navy. So the Navy, I mentioned, they have something called the SMEO. That's again like their software cadre. And they've actually gone out and looked at all of their software factories and looked at how they can become more efficient. So we've done all of this kind of baselining, like George said, across the departments, collected these success stories. They're throughout the report, so you'll see them throughout. Those little green stickies up there are introductions into different areas in the report where you can find some of those. But we really, again, encourage you to read the report. We're not going to read it to you today, but give you kind of some spoilers so that you'll want to go read the report and read some more about some of these success stories. All right. Okay. You want to add anything to the success stories?
Just on coming on to the next slide, it's funny, sometimes we would ask each other, is there anything that you found in this report that surprised you? And actually we came up with a number of items, which is a good thing because you wouldn't just want to go out there and have your preconceptions and find everything that mapped to that. It's good to be surprised. And one of the things that did surprise us was discovering that there are really 4 different types of software factories that have different missions, different value propositions, to a certain extent, even different cultures, and that was a surprise. So when I would say a software factory, I sort of would think Platform One. That would be just sort of what would be in my mind. But come to find out that actually there are different missions. You could have the sort of what we call the enterprise software factory, which is the idea that different kind of organizations can come to it. They will have the infrastructure as code, you can have multiple pipelines, and you can basically bring your development to this enterprise pipeline, and they will host it. They will supply the DevSecOps capabilities for you. Then there's the idea of mission critical, which I think is also called fit for purpose sometimes, which would be really embedded typically within a weapon systems, and it would be a software factory that would be customized particularly for the needs of that mission. So it'd be like a captive software factory, if you will. But then there was also the other idea that there were some software factories whose primary mission was training. Okay, was to train staff and military folks on actually what are the processes, how do you go about using it, so that then they could go back to their own units and use these techniques. And then there were also other ones that were more concerned with innovation. Okay, and of course innovation is extremely important in DevSecOps. The tools and technologies are constantly evolving, and you don't really want to try that out on the critical path of getting your program or getting your application deployed. So the idea that there are some incubators here or innovation pipelines to try some of these things out, and then they can possibly get promoted to one of the enterprise or the mission critical software factories was also very heartening to see and very appropriate for what the DoD needs to be doing. But again, it was a surprise. We hadn't realized that was out there. Anything you'd like to add on those?
To sort of like give a little bit more color to this, in the enterprise space, like Bridget was saying, in the Air Force in particular with the Software Directorate, ThunderCamp is an enterprise software factory. The ThunderCamp folks, they build platform engineering, they understand the DevSecOps pieces, but they're not necessarily building the software that goes on the airframes. There's separate factories that leverage that enterprise capability. They'll be in the mission critical space. So the folks that maintain the F-16, the bombers, the attack aircrafts, they all leverage enterprise capability. So we're seeing a stratification similar to what you see in industry, where the platform engineering teams are supporting the actual software factories that are developing code. And we've seen that stratification in the department, which is very important. Another great enterprise capability is the Big Bang inside Platform One. Platform One actually crosses some of these capabilities, where Big Bang is infrastructure as code and pipeline tooling, optimization for how those tooling and the tests operate, but it doesn't actually build code. If you want to build code, you would go to Party Bus in the Platform One space, or you go to a factory that instantiates a Big Bang environment, and then they bring their domain expertise. So from a culture aspect, the folks in the enterprise space, they're kind of like the geeks. They're the ones that are really into the software, and the folks in the mission critical are really delivering capability. They work more with the end customers. So we're seeing the cultural aspects of who's interested in what parts of the technology kind of gravitating towards it. In the training space, the Army Software Factory in Austin, their goal is to bring Army soldiers in to train them on what it means to be a software developer, to sort of take the notion of software empowering the mission, empowering the warfighter, and get that indoctrinated into their staff so they can go back out in the field and they can use software better. So they're not necessarily developing end-user applications or mission applications, but they're sort of understanding the cultural aspects of how software is changing the way that we operate. So this sort of concept of digital arsenals and the separation, sort of the division of expertise and cultural focus is really fascinating. So it was cool when we pulled out sort of that recognition. There was also a really interesting study in the report about the cultural aspects, the basic, is it like the leadership? Is it the sort of the nurturing aspects? Is it more of the challenge aspects? So a mapping of those cultural aspects to the different kinds of software factories. So.
Yeah, so I'll add on the culture piece because I love culture. I'd love to talk about culture because without culture, we don't get anywhere. I used to say, so the PEO in the F-35 came to me and said, okay, Bridget, we've been really successful with Agile. Next step, DevSecOps. And I was like, what's that? Right? This is like 2019. I was like, what's that? I don't know what that is. He was like, well, I guess you'll figure it out, won't you? I was like, yes, sir, I will. Right? So I proceeded to figure out what that was. And after a couple of months of working with our industry partner, he said, Bridget, what's your blockers? I said, sir, the tech is easy. You know what? We have a cloud, we have tools, we have code in the cloud, we have connections. That part's easy. The hard part is the culture, right? Having the organizations that are going to certify the code understand what we're doing and understand that it's not more risky. It's actually less risky because we've automated it, right? I don't have one guy whose job it is to compile the code and, oh, by the way, he's on leave this week because he's at the beach and we can't compile the code. We can compile the code multiple times a day. Like, this part is easy. The hard part is the culture. How do you bring all of the very risk-averse certification authorities along? How do I bring my users who are not used to being involved at that level? How do I bring them? That's the hard part, right? That's the part that takes so long. And so we actually came up with 7 cultural attributes for DevSecOps as part of the study, which I thought was really phenomenal. So we actually worked this with MITRE as well. And through, kind of academic review and our own experience, we came up with 7 attributes. We don't have a slide for it, but I'll talk through it. Leadership, effective communication, collaborative team environment, empowered workforce. That piece is huge. How many times do we not have an empowered workforce? Rapid feedback loops, continuous learning and skill development, and then a skilled workforce. Those are the pieces that are the secret sauce to being successful. And then guess what we did? We actually measured that. In the report, we've got data that shows back to the digital arsenal which ones are better at leadership or which ones are better at collaboration. And guess what? Spoiler alert, it's not what I would have guessed. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because I want you to read the report. But there are some things that I think as you look at it, you'll go, I wouldn't have guessed that you see some of the attributes scoring higher than others. So really encourage you to take a look at that. If culture is of interest to you, it's really interesting to see how it came out.
Okay. Yeah, and just one last thing. I think it's interesting to note that it's not like with a lot of the stuff that we found during this survey, this is all organic. It's not like somebody sat down from the top and said, I see 4 different types of software factories, and this is what they're going to be doing. A lot of what we were doing was discovering patterns of things that happened organically. And so it's just in the course of trying to fulfill their mission, in the course of trying to make DevSecOps a capability that was accessible, they sort of gravitated into these categories. So this was more of a pattern discovery. And that's where we're finding a lot of just innate wisdom in terms of where people were going and the fact that DevSecOps has been such a ground-up development within the DoD.
Could go back to where we started at the beginning. Where are we 5 years into our journey? Where are we going to be 10 years into the journey? A lot of the work so far has been organic. It's been set with guidance at the CIO level, innovation, and sort of doing the right things at the execution level. What we're seeing now, if you look at 5 years in, across the services, they're starting to take control and management over their operations. So we're seeing sort of a fundamental transition from an organic capability into more of a managed capability. There was a great Navy report looking at about 15 to 20 software factories in the Navy and starting to understand how resources are being allocated to them, where there's challenges from a business perspective, in the funding space, in the leadership space. The other really interesting thing we're doing is trying to understand where programs fail. There's still too many programs that don't get into production. What are the attributes of that, and how does DevSecOps affect that? You know, we can kind of understand that from the technical standpoint, but it has to be managed as a business. The whole aspect of leadership. Like, a program can never get into production unless there's a leader. We can write the best code, but if there's not a leadership and a cultural environment where that code gets into production, and typically in the way we do division of authority in the Department of Defense, the end user has the final say. Like, if that's the case and the end user has not been participating in the process, they're not bought in, it's never going to get into production. We see that across multiple development efforts. It's the leadership, the collaboration, the top level control that says we are going to push this into production. Like, the goal shouldn't be, is the program going to be a success? The program is, when is it going to be a success? It shouldn't be a question of how it goes into production. It should go into production within like 2 to 3 months after it starts. Like, if it's not going into production, if some aspects are not going into production, it's never going to get there. The more we develop before putting into production, the more risk there is to actually getting into production. So by having the services understand the technology can push into production, the authoritative sources, the cyber folks that usually are at the end, the system assurance folks that are at the end, the testing that's at the end, give us a system and we'll test it for 6 months or a year to make sure it's effective. Like, none of that makes sense. That has to be baked into the system from the front. And the leadership has to break down those silos and have them injected into the whole DevSecOps Infinity Loop pipeline. So we're seeing the cultural aspects, we're seeing the success where that has happened. But now in terms of a department, we have to put the policy in place that changes the bulk of the department and how they operate. So that's where we're going to be taking this report and saying, these are the policy changes that are going to have to happen. So that's an interesting observation of how we improve the technology, which we proved it, yes. But how do we actually make it effective within the department? They're not technical decisions, they're strategic, they're leadership, they're cultural, they're training, they're assurance, they're building confidence across all of the components that have a say that, yeah, we're doing stuff together.
And yeah, just building on that, when you look at this next slide, I talked before about how sometimes we'd say, what surprised you? And I have to say that coming from most of my experience in the corporate world, when I came in and we started looking at like how these things were funded, because that was a natural question, what's their funding model? And it was really very diverse. It was very, in some case, in the germination stage. Sometimes there'd be lots of different kinds of funding, wherever they could get the money from, from different places. And like, to me, like I said, coming from more corporate world, I was like, oh, okay, what is this? Because the first thing you sort of work out is your funding model and you get it approved. And I think looking at this, it made us sort of realize a lot of where the DoD is right now. If anyone of you are familiar with the sort of crossing the chasm model, and you look at really moving from the early adopters to the early middle, and that really sort of became a constant theme that we started to see. That's sort of where the DoD is. So whereas in some cases, at least on the DevSecOps area, in some cases you'd say, well, DoD is a big enterprise, this should all be worked out. But no, it's coming more as a startup, and it's coming as a startup whose time has now come to transition to an enterprise capability. And so consequently, you're seeing right now where there are lots of different sort of funding models, which one is going to evolve as the winner, if you will, for some of the different software factories, and which ones will not, is something that has to be part of the maturation process.
It really does, and like Nanette said, so it's really interesting. So I mentioned that I grew up in what is now the Software Directorate. They are a fee-for-service model, meaning every government customer comes to them and says, hey, I'm going to pay you X million dollars a year to sustain the software for F-15 or F-22 or this EW system. So the government pays another government organization to do that work. Some of these are enterprise funded by a larger organization within the service. Some of them have gotten congressional funding over time. So there's just these different funding models and colors of money, and they all work a little bit differently and all have different challenges. So I actually had the opportunity to go to Bespin. Anybody familiar with Bespin? All right, a lot here. So Bespin is the Air Force software factory for business enterprise systems, so business applications and mobile applications. So I talked to them and I said, hey, what's your business model? They're like, oh, well, we essentially get money from a customer who has a requirement, and then we take that money and we put it on contract. I said, okay, well, that's good. I said, but how do you scale that? And they were like, well, what do you mean? I said, you have a core team that is running this. If you get to the point where you have thousands of applications, you can't grow your core team because your business model doesn't allow you. You're taking money and you're putting it on contract. You're almost a pass-through. But how do you grow your team inside? How do you grow that core team? And they're like, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. You're right, that's a challenge. I said, guess what? That working capital fund actually lets you do that because it allows you to grow your overhead. It's a government organization. There's no overhead, but let's just say it's overhead, right? Lets you grow your overhead to scale to the number of customers and the amount of work that you have. I said, you guys got to think about how do we scale these types of factories to meet the need, because over time, we're going to have more and more requirements for warfighters with mobile applications. They're not carrying ruggedized backpacks, with laptops in them anymore. They've got mobile apps, right? And they said, oh yeah, you know what? We're trying to figure out how do we buy devices and provide them to our customers. I was like, yeah, see, there's this whole model you've got to consider. This isn't traditional DoD acquisition anymore, right? You got to consider, how do you grow your capability? How do you scale it? So if then you're buying mobile hardware, how do you account for it? How do you inventory it? Like, there's this whole piece that the DoD hasn't gotten to yet, because we've been growing this as a grassroots effort, and now we're at the point we have to figure out how to scale it. And our models within DoD don't really support that today. So, Bespin is one you actually see. They're on multiple examples of how their funding works, right? And a lot of the other factories are there too, because we've kind of just taken this grassroots approach, and now we've got to figure out, is there color? You all maybe have heard of colorless money. It's not really a thing, but we call it colorless money, right? And so it's essentially a way that the DoD can say, okay, again, software's never done. How do we match to that? How do we actually take from requirement to deployment and continuously updating without having to have all of these different appropriations and constraints in the way that we use our money? How do we then scale something like that to the software factories so they're not having to go, okay, I built an application, it's deployed tomorrow, now I've got to use a different color of money because now it's actually deployed. It's way too complicated. We've got to find ways to make this more efficient. And as George said, we've got to build in policies to allow us to do these things.
I'd like to say it's not complete chaos. People would think that. If you look at the commercial sector, startups are where the chaos happens. Startups is where all the excitement happens. Startups never have a lot of money, and startups never know where their next dollar is coming from until the technology is proven. And as soon as something gets proven, startups get acquired, they get conglomerated into different things. Money flows into them basically for advertising and for scale. At the department, the software factories are the startups. They've proven successful, and now you're seeing the services come in and say, we're going to put investments in here. We're going to take the technology, we're going to scale it up, we're going to do consistent modeling. We're going to not have every startup do their own HR department, their own finance department, their own marketing department, their own advertising, their own development. We're trying to separate that and say, this is where the investment has to go from an enterprise level. So when we talked about the Navy's new office, they're doing the consolidation and they're funding big Navy money into these programs. The same in the Air Force Software Directorate. Software Directorate has got PEO money, it's got large money, it's going to go and fund this. So if you're trying to look at where the department's going, the report shows you how we've built that sort of startup investment, and we're at the point where we're starting to see the larger funding and turning this from, this is how we should do it, into this is our normal operating procedure. So it's a really exciting time to see the sort of the investment bankers coming in and starting to mature it and really take the value and sort of make that available across the entire department.
And just a little bit continuing on with that theme of the sort of crossing the chasm. One of the things, obviously, wanted to do when we went out and did this report is start to gather data, right? But when we went to gather data, we found that maybe they didn't really, at this point, have the kind of data that we were looking for. They collected data, but the data was to help them manage their factories. So data was to help them execute their mission. And the data was within a context that they all understood. This is our data. We understand all the contextual parameters and what's meaningful and what's not. And that's a different kind of use of data than when you need data to manage from an enterprise perspective, when you need data that's a little more able to be consolidated to look and say, how do we build a portfolio? When you have data that needs to be presented to people who don't necessarily know your mission and don't necessarily know your context. And that, again, is just like with the funding model, is another point of transition in terms of getting a consolidated approach to how we can gather data that fits the purposes of enterprise management.
Yeah, we have lots of DORA metrics. Like, we can tell you exactly how every platform is working separately, but when you try and compare it and you look at value stream metrics or business metrics or KPRs, you can't really do that analysis with the detailed data and the higher level data. So it's really interesting, like when we say data, what we actually mean. If you go to the commercial space, you get the DORA metrics, but they can't compare. Value stream is really where we're trying to get to. Look at the end result of how quickly we can go from a concept to value actually into the warfighter's hands, and then looking at the bigger business metrics so we can figure out where investment needs to go to enhance the overall portfolios.
Okay, now we're going to talk about policy and guidance. And this was an area that I was really more deeply involved with, and we had a number of workshops, I think with over 50 participants from all sorts of different areas to talk about it. And the thing that really sort of changed my whole outlook was early on was two concepts that surfaced from the workshops. The one thing was someone saying culture interprets policy, okay? And the other thing was that policy and guidance need to be seen as part of change management. And those were two things, we were going to do the policy task. It's like, okay, what things should be in the policy or whatnot. But that really, people had a totally different outlook on it. And so, for example, when they say that the culture interprets policy, one of the things people were bringing up was that you could have like a vision level kind of policy, if you will, or instruction. But then that has to get filtered down through to the operations. As it's getting filtered, even though the person at the top might be looking with a very agile perspective, it's being filtered through the lens of people who are seeing things in a very waterfall perspective until by the time it gets down to the executable operational type policy, it's really transformed from the original intent. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to try to say, well, what is it that you guys are finding that isn't working for you about policy, and how can we turn that into a positive? How can we say, like, this is what we'd like to see? This is what we'd like to see policy for DevSecOps be, because we've been writing policy for waterfall for a long time, but how should policy for DevSecOps be written? It's a little bit like the medium is the message, right? If you're writing policy in a sort of a waterfall type mentality, okay, is that really appropriate for a domain which is very agile and which is going to be changing quickly? So some of the things that people said was it needs to be, we came up with the acronym SPEED with 3 E's, is that it needs to be socialized. And what does that really mean? You can't just put out a paper. I took a course I'm going to talk a little bit about the competing values framework, and I took a course from a woman who taught that, and she defined culture as the way we do things around here, right? Okay, and so if everyone knows the way, if you're writing policy and guidance for a waterfall mentality, and your policy and guidance is really just codifying and formalizing what everybody knows, and how everybody approaches a problem, that's one thing. But if you're writing policy and guidance that says, no, we're going to change the way we do things, okay, that's another thing. You can't just sort of drop that as a Word document. You have to sort of go out and have more dialogue with people, make sure people really understand the why and the spirit in which it needs to be implemented, right? Which is a change in mentality from waterfall to agile. Another thing was it must address the entire portfolio. And this was where, as we all know, like DevSecOps started more with IT and business type systems. And so there could be some frustration to say, well, this all works for IT or business systems or apps, but what about for embedded systems? So the idea was we understand that some things might be more mature for software, but then let's just put that out there and say, okay, yeah, we've solved this problem for software. Not yet, it's still a work in process for embedded, but this is how we're working towards that. That it has to be executable, okay? So the other thing they're saying is sometimes you can have something that is, a strategic vision, right? This is where we want to be in 5 to 10 years, but when we get it, we have to do it right now, okay? And this is where they're talking about integrating policy and guidance into a change management. So you might have some policy and guidance that's more of a vision, that's a roadmap, but then the policy and guidance that I need to have right now needs to be executable right now, and maybe we have to see how it's going to morph down the road. It has to take into consider implementer expertise, and this was a point of debate. Some people said, well, the people, particularly with the idea of the transition from waterfall to agile, they would say, well, in agile, the policy and guidance wants you to make more judgment calls, take more risks, but people might not have the expertise to do that. We should have more if-then-else kind of policy and guidance. But other people said, no, it's too complex. You can't really do that. And so the idea is to make sure that when you're putting out the policy and guidance, that the people have the expertise and the training to make the judgment calls that is necessary to implement the policy and guidance. The fact that it must evolve, okay, and clearly, I've worked on policy and guidance teams, and it can take a while to get out some policy and guidance, but this area is changing so quickly, and they say, but it's got to be able to evolve faster, and furthermore, it has to be able to evolve not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. And that's where we've got a lot of things like the Software Factory Coalition, the communities of practice, so that there has to be a feedback loop. It has to evolve quickly, and it has to evolve iteratively with feedback from the operational units. And also that it has to be easily discoverable. Sometimes you can, I know there's different URLs and things like that, but sometimes it can be hard to find the policy. We've talked to people, it's like, well, there's this policy. I didn't know there was this policy. Where can I find this policy? And go to this kind of URL. And the idea is that it should be much, much easier. I think of when I can go to Google, okay, and I can have something that I'm thinking about that's a highly contextualized, just a personal thing, scenario, and I can Google it, and I'll find somebody with an opinion on it, even if it's just some subreddit thread, you know what I mean? I can say, I don't have to remember, well, if I want to find out stuff about my dog food, I'll go here. If I want to find out about what kind of vacuum cleaner I want to buy, I'll go here. If I want to find out about skincare, I'll go here. No, just go to Google, okay, and so that's the same thing. Even though a lot has been done to have different URLs are here, that can get fatiguing, and it should be very easy to say, this is my problem. What's the policy and guidance that addresses this problem? Boom. So a lot more easy to discover. And so the second thing that we wanted to just talk about a little bit is this competing values framework. And the competing values framework is a cultural framework that we were familiar with prior to doing this study. And it's not like we went into this study saying, oh, we're going to apply the competing values framework. But the more that we saw issues coming up, the more, and patterns of disconnects, the more that we said, the competing values framework could really help us to make sense out of this. Okay, so just a really quick thing. What the competing values framework is it looks at culture in terms of these 4 quadrants, and there's 2 axes. right? One is how much does the culture value individuality and flexibility? And the other is how much does the culture value stability and control? And the other axis is how much is it internally focused versus externally focused? And this framework, by the way, has been around for 30 or 40 years, and actually what we didn't know was that it's taught at Air University, so we found that out actually later. So, and the key thing about these is that these cultures have different values, okay? And by a value, they say, well, what value does my organization deliver? You know, what skills and activities deliver this value? What behaviors are valued? How am I valued? All of these things are value propositions that help to define the culture. So clan or collaborative is more about commitment, communication, and development. The creativity is more about being innovative, transformation, being agile. The hierarchy control is more about being efficient, timely, consistent, uniformity, right? And the market compete is more about mission achievement. So what you'll find a lot when you're moving from this waterfall culture is you had a lot of value in hierarchy and control. Okay, we have precise procedures, we're following these precise procedures. Okay, but now when you get to agile, you start to get more value around, well, creativity, and also competition, the mission focus. We have to get this mission, we have to get it out there quickly, and we have to be creative about how we're going to do it. So that's where you start to see this different kind of cultural disconnect. I mean, examples are, I have some quotes, people would say, well, I'm agile up until I get to test, and then it shuts down, right? And test is traditionally more about hierarchy and control. And one of the things that we really liked about the competing values framework is that it doesn't say one is right and one is wrong, right? They'll say, first of all, certain organizations might have different cultural emphases at different times in their development. Like a startup might really be just create, right? But later down the road, it might have to institute more control. So what the competing value framework talks about is that really the most valuable thing is to synthesize across these different quadrants, and that's where leadership plays a big role. And an example of this is someone was talking about that they were using RMF controls, right? And RMF controls, it's very control-oriented, but they needed to move quickly. You know, they needed to be competitive. Okay, so how are they going to do that? Well, they're going to be creative, and they're going to automate the controls, okay? So the idea is that if you really look at it, sometimes, yeah, you might have to emphasize one or the other. But if you really, really think about it and you really work with the people, you can come up with something that's transformational, that's better, that fits the values of a couple of different quadrants. And that's really where leadership comes in to help people come up with that sort of transformational thinking. So
I hope everyone was expecting to have a whole cultural transformation talk today.
Was that too much? I'm sorry. I was really excited about it. So
this is what we do in the CIO. This is how we do policy. People think it's boring, but it's actually kind of interesting.
Yeah, who knew?
I think we're at a point where we could take some questions.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions?
And if you would, please use the mic so that the recording catches what your question is. Questions for us. We got to get you guys to an hour. We got 10 minutes left or you don't get credit. Please.
Or I could talk some more about policy.
I tried to download the report at the SEI site. Where do you get it?
It's not available yet, so it'll be out later this week. And actually, if you look on the back of the brochure, it gives you the link to where you can download it on the CIO website. So we're hoping maybe Friday, George.
I have to apologize for that. We had all of the events, the outgoing marketing events scheduled, but policy does sometimes move slow. I need one more signature. I think it's going to happen this afternoon, and the report will go on the CIO library. So if you want to go to the CIO library and read the implementation plan that went out on Monday, that'll take 2 days, and by the time you finish that, this report should be there, and you could follow that one up.
We also have an email address. We'd love, after you read the report, to give us some feedback. because we want to do this again, right? We're going to do this again at some point. And so we really want feedback in, were you looking for something that we didn't have? What did you like? What did you not like? So we do have an email address here as well. All right, question please.
Sure, so appreciate it. It's good to look back with all the conversations about innovation going on right now and how we need to just squash things to see the innovation that has occurred in the last 5 years, and I appreciate you guys capturing that. My line of questioning on that, though, is maybe for George and Nanette. While the software factories have proven themselves as startups and the enterprises are coming in and funding them, how do we prevent the larger enterprises from coming in, funding them, and then also imposing those larger hierarchical cultural norms on them that are going to squash the innovation that takes place at the software factories?
Yeah, these are the fun questions. I had some of the software factories, we go and they're worried as soon as they become successful, they're going to be a competition to an installed base. It's really that cultural management. At the top down, we have to be driven by mission imperatives. And the mission imperative, you can see from what's happening in the world today. The ability to get software into the field is really what we have to do. Like the ability to take new sensors, to integrate new sensors, it's changing software. So the models that are 2 or 3 years down the road, the people that are worried about the old ways, they're just not effective. As a department, we have to understand that, and that change has to really come from the top. We can be organic from the bottom, we can improve the technology, but we have to work as one department. We have to have one mission imperative. A lot of the change that we're seeing with the new administration is moving fast, breaking old systems. It's painful, but the change is happening at a rate that is uncomfortable for the department, and it's going to have to really reflect the new department. So I wish there was an easy answer. We spent all this time in the report to talk about cultural change and policy. Policy really needs to be incorporated at the right time. I'm super excited about the way that the service has embraced it, particularly the Army with new directives coming down. When the CIO puts a policy out, they put a DoD instruction out, that's the new law. It's no longer optional. When CIO, we write guidance, we write a lot of guidance, this is how it be. But when there's an instruction comes down, that's the law, and you see fundamental change. And we're getting to the point where those laws and those instructions are coming out from the service CIOs that are really directing how we change. So we're getting the top cover, and that's really where the answer has to come from. It has to be top down to force the big change. We can do it from the bottom up on how the change should happen, but you need sort of the hand in hand. The bottom showing how it should happen and what's effective, and the top saying, this is a new law, this is how we're going to start operating.
Do you want to add anything to that?
No, except that I do think that it will be very important to maintain that sort of culture and that the passion, okay, that has got us where we are right now, okay? And like I said, it's crossing the chasm stage. We need to institutionalize stuff. It needs to become an enterprise capability. But you also have to remember what got us here, okay, which was grassroots and passion. And so balancing those two is going to be tricky.
And I'll add, at the service level, we've seen them embrace and enable culture a little differently. So at the Air Force level, right, when Kessel Run was first stood up and I walked in the room, I'm like, where are the military uniforms? They were wearing golf shirts and khakis, right? I was like, this is different, right? They worked in these big, open, WeWork facilities that aren't cube farms. Well, that was different. Right, the commander really wasn't known as the commander; he was the CEO, and that's how Bespin is run too. Colonel Huff is the CEO of Bespin. We don't talk that way in the military typically about organizations, but they are living the culture that they want within their factory based on how they have established it. They have a C-suite like a small business. Right, and so they are really at the Air Force level, at least I've seen it more than others, embracing how they are trying to build their culture within their factories, and I think it's really great to see that. So, all right, next question, please.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, by the way. So, with software factories, you talked about cultural transformation, but again, part of the other things which is really coming up with the new administration are, AI and agentic AI. Which really comes down to it is bringing new tools and bringing, upskilling the whole teams from that perspective. How do you see that is going to impact all your teams and the culture, as well as, the speed which you are really talking about, the uncomfortable part of that speed, which is going to even go higher from here. Thank you.
Yeah, if you read the implementation plan, so 23, 24, we were doing fundamental structures. The new implementation plan has a whole focus on AI and legacy transformation. That's really what we're looking at the next 2 years. The approach to AI so far we've taken is look at it in two ways. One is AI to enhance the process. You're looking at the software development lifecycle, looking at the AI tools. So if you talk in the commercial space, they're seeing huge improvements in productivity from software engineers. That's really from using AI in the production cycle. So AI for a software development lifecycle is one of the efforts we kicked off, understanding what tools work, what paradigms work, and trying to get that efficiency. So going from taking 2 or 3 months to working with teams and just getting the individual productivity down. The second aspect is using AI in mission systems. So things like in CIO, where we're taking AI models and we're incorporating AI models, which are really just software into larger software systems. So that's the second thing. How do we get the ethical AI? We use the AI models in a way that's commensurate with the DoD mission, with the weapon systems and the control over. That's more of a policy statement right now. From the DevSecOps perspective, we're just treating it like software models and software that needs to go through. So we're looking at the supply chains, the way that the models are incorporated, the way that they're tested and injected into the DevSecOps Infinity Loop. But both aspects have to happen. I think the part you're worried most about is like the ethical pieces and the governance. CDAO is really focusing on that. We're trying to get the efficiency and we want to get all software into production. So AI is just another piece of that.
Thank you for the question. Next question, please.
Good morning. Thank you for organizing the panel. 2 questions. The first question is, you mentioned we have to operate as one department, but we also have 50 to 75 software factories, I think was the number you guys threw out. Former DoD CIO Sherman talked a lot about software factory interoperability and reciprocity. Can you share some thoughts about what you guys have found or what the way forward for the department is in terms of that goal? And the second question was platform as a service for software factory versus I'm going to provide you software factory, but you have to bring your own people and you have to bring your own expertise to make pipelines and run the pipelines and all that. So what, if you guys have any thoughts on a platform as a service versus kind of a more infrastructure as a service type of approach?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. Reciprocity, sort of the way that we're trying to accelerate the authority to operate and get into production is through continuous authorization to operate. That's sort of the mantra that the software factories operate with. The concept is if you pass all the gates, then all the checks that you would do at the end have been incorporated and you should be ready to operate. We're trying to get software factories approved so it goes right into production. And it's not so much getting the ATO, it's getting into production is the fundamental thing we want to get to. ATO has always been an impediment to that. ATO is still necessary. We'll put ATO as one of the criterias for a software factory, but continuous ATO is how you get the results or the products out of that software into production. So that's where we're trying to go. The concept of reciprocity usually comes up with sharing containers across different software factories, having one authorizing official blessing a container and then having a second authorizing official use that. Reciprocity, in one sense, you would think it's been looked at, but in the department, we kind of separate that to 2 pieces. One is, has it been inspected? And then the 2 is, how is it relevant for the use? The inspection, we can make standards so everyone has the same inspection so you can make the same evaluation. But depending on how that's going to be used in operations, it's hard to get that one through reciprocity because every domain is separate. So we're trying to sort of break into 2 pieces, accelerate and get reciprocity where it's fast so that we have a standard body of evidence for all containers, for all software. And then the risk evaluation, that's more of a subjective part. And we're trying to go after that one in sort of a different fashion. But pushing things through the software factory, through continuous authorization, when you come out of a software factory, you have to go into production in order to be DevSecOps. So that production domain really happens on the second side, and the evaluation of the appropriateness should be baked into the pipeline, and then coming out, going into production should be seamless. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it, the getting it into production effectively, reciprocity by showing consistent bodies of evidence so we can share across factories, and then keeping the domain relevance as part of the process at the end point so that it feeds back in. And then the second question, I'll turn it to you guys.
Yeah. Sure. So I'll just give you my opinion, right? None of us knows what the future looks like, but so I don't think we'll have less software factories in the future. I think we'll have more, but I think we'll have more enterprise services. I think we have to scale, right? Because we can't continue to have every organization buy their own version of GitHub or Atlassian tools, right? That doesn't scale well. That's inefficient. And so I think we have to move toward more DoD enterprise licensing and services that we can just say, hey, the DoD is the biggest customer for X tool, and we have the ability to provide it to whatever service. I think we're going to have to do the same with infrastructure. I think we have to be able to do that for efficiency so that we can continue to scale. We're not going to have less software in the DoD. We're going to have way more. With AI, it's going to get bigger, right? I think we're going to continue to do that, and we have to find the right way to scale that in a way that's cost effective, but allows us to spin up a new factory when we need to with enterprise services, and when we don't need it anymore, spin it down. The hard part to me becomes, how do you deal with all the cost associated with data, with cloud, right? Like, how do we deal with those kinds of things? But I think we have to get there. That has to be the next step. We've started this grassroots effort, but we have to scale it in a smart way. And I think that's something we've got to figure out as a department, how we do that in a way that allows us to grow software more and more efficiently.
I think we're at the hour and 2-minute mark.
Yeah.
So everyone got all of your education
You got your
credits.
hour. Scan your badge on the way out.
We'll be around. I would love to keep talking, but I think we have to wrap it up now. Thank you all for attending.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much.